Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Din, and I am the Chief Medical Information Officer and the co-founder of FraudLens Inc. FraudLens was designed to shift the focus of anti-fraud, waste, and abuse efforts from the pay and chase model to a prepay, pre-adjudication, detect, and prevent model. In other words, identify the fraud, waste, and abuse early and prevent the payment in the first place. This new approach requires a different way of thinking and a different set of tools. This webinar will present the things that make detect and prevent work so that you can add these ideas and tools to your own anti-fraud, waste, and abuse toolbox. I want to take a few minutes to review the current state of the industry just to level set for all the attendees. The current basic approach to dealing with fraud, waste, and abuse is commonly called pay and chase. That means the claims are paid, and then sometime in the future, the payer finds out that they should not have paid those claims and then tries to recover the money. The money recovery, when it is successful, is usually pennies on the dollar, and this approach is used by everyone. But even with all this effort, pay and chase is stagnant. The success of pay and chase has leveled out despite the increased effort and increased funding. The Office of the Inspector General of HHS reports that anti-fraud, waste, and abuse efforts from 2009 to 2016 shows an average of $2.56 billion per year, with the best result of a little over $3 billion in a single year. This is only a single-digit percentage success rate. I think it is also useful to do the math to see the scope of the problem. The entire healthcare market in 2012 was about $2.8 trillion. Healthcare fraud is estimated to be between 10 and 30% of the total healthcare spend. If we use that low figure, 10%, that means that $280 billion was lost. That equates to nearly $9,000 per second. Now, since the beginning of this slide, the calculator has been running. And in the approximately 30 seconds that it has taken for me to present this slide, nearly $270,000 has been lost. Clearly, fraud, waste, and abuse is huge and has been a problem over decades, with success rates stuck in the single-digit percentages. Some would say that this is proof that fraud, waste, and abuse is an intractable problem, with no hope for greater success. I think it's worthwhile to take a look at other intractable problems and how those were addressed. Specifically, we will look at inner-city crime, nuclear weapons, and smoking to see if there's anything that we can learn from these efforts. Inner-city crime was out of control in the 1970s and early 80s. Crime rates were high and growing every year. Entire neighborhoods, like the South Bronx and Bedford-Stuyvesant, were deemed dangerous. Then, the broken windows theory gained traction in the late 80s, and cities like New York City began to improve. Broken windows states that in order to make a real impact on crime, you must deal with the environment that suggests to the criminals that antisocial behavior and petty crimes will be tolerated. In other words, we need to change the ground rules. Start to enforce the rules against graffiti artists. Add on-foot police presence. Fix broken windows, doors, and locks. And each single one of these things suggests to the criminals that there is a new focus on regaining control by the law-abiding. I was in dental school in northern New Jersey in the mid-70s and spent time in New York City. If you walked around Times Square, the picture on the left of the screen is what you saw in theaters. They did not show the latest Star Wars. If you rode the subway, the picture on the right is what you experienced. The subway cars were old, noisy, smelly, graffiti-filled, and home to roving youth gangs. After the adoption of broken windows into policing, the tide against inner-city crime began to turn. The end result is that Times Square in 2010 is 180 degrees different from the 1970s. This picture shows families, couples, and tourists, all enjoying Times Square at night. The theaters are all showing mainstream movies and Broadway shows. The same thing applies to residential areas. This is a picture of the South Bronx. This looks like a war zone. Burnt-out buildings, and almost no human activity. This is a picture of the exact same area in 2010, after years of broken windows success. It looks like a normal suburb. So it is safe to say that broken windows, as a new approach to dealing with inner city crime, did provide a solution to a problem that many experts thought was unsolvable. Since the beginning of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union built and compiled nuclear weapons without restriction. The arsenals got larger, more powerful, and more deadly. There seemed to be no end to the buildup, despite arsenals that were capable of ending all life on Earth 10 times over. That is, until May 26, 1972, when the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was signed by the United States and the Soviet Union. While this treaty did little to solve the problem, it did succeed in getting both sides to agree that they had enough nuclear weapons. A small advance, but by using this small success as a starting point and as an example of what was possible, the two sides eventually agreed over time to add additional incremental steps. Today, there has been a massive reduction in the total number of nuclear weapons. Smoking has been a problem since the founding of the United States. In 1965, 43% of the adult population smoked. This is despite the fact that everyone knew that smoking was bad for your health. Smoking was cool. The Surgeon General's warning about the hazards of smoking started that same year. Every pack of cigarettes had to have the warning. In addition, advertising bans, public service announcements, and smoke-free environments all added to the effort to reduce the incidence of smoking. The end result is that, in 2014, only 17% are smokers, and smoking is definitely uncool. We have seen significant results with other intractable problems. So what lessons can we learn from them that we can now apply to healthcare fraud, waste, and abuse? These are the lessons that we see. First, you must deal with the small stuff. It is not enough to look to solve the $1 million fraud. You must also attack the $100 fraud. You must be willing to expand or change the focus of your efforts. You can set success as stopping the providers from submitting fraudulent claims instead of looking for criminal convictions. Do not try for the big bang. Incremental successes are easier to achieve and may set the stage for future wins. Any evidence of a change away from the pattern of problematic claims is a good start. Use the softer sciences to your advantage. Peer pressure and appeals to morality and ethics, etc., may be as effective as threats. A provider who has shown that overcoding and overtreatment are harmful to the patient appeals to the inherent morality of the provider. Efforts to deal with fraud, waste, and abuse must also be consistent and must show escalating consequences for continued bad behavior. A single one-time warning is easy to dismiss as a fluke and not likely to be repeated. If you accept everything I have discussed up till now, then you are forced to conclude that we need a better strategy to make an impact on the fraud, waste, and abuse that escapes our current efforts. I am not saying that we need to abandon the current efforts. Rather, I am saying that we need another strategy to complement the current approach. A strategic and tactical approach that complements the current pay and chase. A strategy and execution that can separate the basically honest opportunists from the true criminals by moving away from adversarial enforcement and punishment towards collegial resolution. A strategy and execution that eliminates the benignly neglectful environment in which bad acts are tolerated because everyone else is doing it. A strategy and execution that targets systemic vulnerabilities rather than bad acts. A strategy and execution that is independent of dollars lost. A strategy and execution that increases the risk to reward ratio for small dollar bad claims. The tools that we need to execute this new strategy include informatics, clinical knowledge, forensics, information technology, and leadership. I will consider each of these over the next set of slides. Let's start with the informatics component. Most organizations take a data approach to analytics. The data approach severely limits the ability to derive actionable insights into fraud, waste, and abuse. A data approach is limited to the explicit, that is, the text or the numbers in a cell in a table or a document. Context is completely missing. The informatics approach understands that data is actually a representation of a real event. And because of this, each data element contains additional implicit, contextual, relational, and networked information that can be exploited to enhance the analysis. Using the informatics approach, a treatment code for surgery tells us that a surgeon was involved, anesthesia was used, surgical support was involved, etc., etc. Each of these may provide the necessary additional information to prove fraud, waste, and abuse. For example, if there is a claim for a surgery and there is no corresponding record of anesthesia being administered, something is wrong. In other words, the informatics approach recognizes that data contains more information than you think. To help you understand the difference between a data approach and an informatics approach, think of icebergs. The part of the iceberg that you can see is the data approach. The bulk of the iceberg is hidden beneath the surface of the ocean, which represents the informatics approach. Another way to conceptualize the informatics approach is to think about nested Russian dolls. The biggest doll is analogous to the data approach, and once you open the biggest doll, you will find additional dolls inside, the informatics approach. This slide lists some of the informatics methods and techniques that are useful to advanced analytics. I will review each and how they apply to advanced analytics in general and to fraud, waste, and abuse detection in specifics. An ontology is a model of the real world or a subset of the real world that is expressed as a hierarchical model of concepts. The core element of an ontology is a concept, and a concept is anything. The earth is a concept. Love is a concept. Sprained ankle is a concept. A concept is anything. Each concept is part of a class and has attributes and relations that define the concept and its place in the world. So the Earth is part of a class of stony planets, has attributes of an atmosphere and a magnetic field, and has relations with biological life. Life inhabits the Earth, and the Earth supports life. A simple real-world example of an ontology is your corporate organization chart. There is logic behind the structure of an ontology, and that logic is accessible by navigating the structure. This allows for automated reasoning simply by navigating the ontology. As an example, anaphylaxis to latex is an acute disease. You can see this as an ontological concept in the next slide. This slide shows a snapshot of the SNOMED CT terminology along the disease axis as shown in the red oval. The green oval is a specific disease of anaphylaxis due to latex. By traversing the path between the two, the red arrow, we can see the logic in how this was classified. Just by navigating the hierarchy, we can reason that anaphylaxis due to latex belongs to a class of acute allergic reaction. To see that, just navigate from the green oval to the blue oval along the blue arrow. The orange oval indicates other relationships attached to the concept of anaphylaxis due to latex that allows additional connection to other concepts and axes. Ultimately, you get a network of concept connections. Concept inheritance is fairly easy to understand. Very closely related things share common traits. Just as human children inherit from their human parents, specific healthcare concepts inherit from a parent healthcare concept. With healthcare concepts organized in an ontological, hierarchical structure, as I described in the previous slide, the children are lower down the hierarchy, while the parents are higher up on the hierarchy. The child concept inherits from the parent concept. For example, all streptococci bacteria, genus or the parent concept, have gram-positive cell walls, and so all subtypes, the species or the child concept, like strep mutans and strep salivarius, have gram-positive cell walls by inheritance. This is reasoning based on inheritance. I'm sure that we all have had a discussion that has eventually morphed into an argument, and at some point in time, one party says to the other, "That's just semantics," or "You're arguing semantics." These are meant to be dismissive statements designed to embarrass the other party into ending the discussion or the argument. In reality, Semantics, or the true meaning of something, is critical to analytics. Semantics allows us to equate different terms as being the same thing in reality. The example on the slide, myocardial infarction and heart attack, are completely different terms, but are actually the same thing. They are semantically identical. Another example is dental caries and tooth decay. Inference is what we can derive through reasoning and logic. For instance, if we have data that states a doctor performed a surgery, we can infer that a patient was present and was recipient of the surgery. Further, we can infer the use of anesthesia. Relative to detecting fraud, waste, and abuse through claims data, we name the inference process orthoinformation. We formally define orthoinformation as the information that is inferred from data, or the extraction of information that is implicit in data. Now, the data-centric amongst you are probably thinking, oh, you're just looking at metadata. While I understand the thinking, there is a distinct difference between metadata and orthoinformation. Metadata is merely data about data, while orthoinformation is information derived from data. To illustrate the difference, let's look at the example on the slide. You have a data element called name with a value of Sun Tzu. For those of you who don't know, he is the author of The Art of War. Metadata for this would be that the data type equals string. Orthoinformation is we know that this person is Chinese because the text form of the data is an anglicized equivalent of Chinese characters. Because the principle of inference is so important to anti-fraud, waste, and abuse work, let's do an exercise in inference. Take a look at this photo. What can you conclude from the picture? We are putting up some questions about this photo in the next slide. We will review the answers later in the presentation. You can pause and rewind the playback to get more time to look at the photo. The questions that apply to the previous photo are, is it cold? Is this a completely temporary structure? Is all the produce grown locally? Is it close to closing time? Feel free to rewind the presentation to review the photo relative to the questions that are being asked. Time is basic to everything in healthcare, but is often misunderstood, undervalued, or ignored. Typically, we think of time as continuously moving forward, like a clock. Seconds become minutes, minutes become hours, etc. But time as it relates to health can be parsed and viewed in other ways. That is because the relationship between time and disease is dependent on context. Time can be periodic. Something happens again and again on a regular basis. An example is taking a pill every 6 hours. Time can overlap. Sometimes something happens and then something else happens before the first event is over. An example is a patient undergoing chemotherapy and develops diabetes during the course of the chemo. Time can flare up, in which case critical decisions must be made quickly. An example is insulin shock. For a diabetic, the need for insulin is continuous. The administration of insulin is periodic. At times, the administration of the insulin that leads to the insulin shock is the flare-up. Regardless of the progress of the other time elements, the flare-up event demands immediate attention. Episodes are a close relative to time analysis. The difference is that an episode encapsulates the entire period of care start to finish. Clearly, an episode is dependent on the clinical condition. An episode for a sprained ankle is much shorter than an episode of care for a heart attack. Also, within an episode, there can be multiple clusters of activity. A sprained ankle is a single cluster in which treatment is very simple. The injured area is examined, the ankle is wrapped, and the patient is sent home with orders to take it easy and to take aspirin. End of episode. In contrast, the heart attack episode may involve a medical cluster, which includes drug treatments, followed by a surgical cluster, which includes a balloon angioplasty. I will now begin to show how these informatics methods can be applied to the specific issue of dealing with fraud, waste, and abuse. Ontologies provide a formal structure against which we can apply formal computational tools for the purposes of analytics. The example on the screen from the CDT coding system is an example of a taxonomic structure in which increasing complexity of treatment is formalized. Since one of the patterns of fraud is to claim a higher paying, more complex treatment, when in fact a simpler treatment is performed, the formal CDT structure provides us with a way to compare the less complex with the more complex. A medical example is use of drug terminologies to detect the abuse of opioids in the absence of medical justification. That is, the strength of the opioid exceeds the threshold of pain relief that is typical for a specific medical condition. The notion of inheritance is more formally understood as type and subtype. So an endodontist is a subtype of dentist. A dentist can be defined as a healthcare provider that is limited to the treatment of oral disease. By inheritance, both dentists and endodontists treat oral disease. Any evidence of an endodontist performing a treatment for a non-oral disease is suspect because, by inheritance, if a dentist is not allowed to treat non-oral disease, the subtype, the endodontist, is not allowed to treat non-oral disease. Endodontics, commonly called a root canal, is not an elective procedure. Nobody goes to the dentist and says, I want a root canal. No one says, I read that Beyonce had a root canal, so I want one. Endodontic treatment is only justified if there is an existing disease state that is amenable to endodontic treatment. Any one of the following terms on the slide are suitable disease states: tooth decay, caries exposure, etc., as a reason for performing endodontics. In other words, for the purposes of proper rationale for treatment, they are semantically the same. As I mentioned before, inferencing, or orthoinformation, is one of the most powerful tools in the toolbox. If we see a claim for an extraction of a soft tissue impaction, you can infer the following items on the slide and then some. Each item provides additional data that can be used in the fraud analysis. For example, if the number of surgeries is markedly more than the number of scalpels used, this is an indicator of fraud. Since we are talking about inference, let us go back to the inference exercise. Here is the picture that I've asked you to review. The first question is it cold in this picture? The answer is yes. There is nothing that explicitly tells you that it is cold in this picture. There is no thermometer that shows 40 degrees Fahrenheit. We can infer the temperature by looking at the evidence in the picture. Look at the green ovals. The customers all have coats on. The vendor on the far left of the picture has a hood-type overcoat. The vendor in the fully zipped down coat has a wool cap. Each of these tells you indirectly, but with absolute certainty, that it is cold in this picture. The next question is this a completely temporary marketplace? The answer is no. While there are cardboard boxes and wooden plastic crates used as tables, that's the yellow rectangle, each stall has a plastic drain pipe from the roof to the ground, that's the red outline. Each stall also has lights, which require a robust electrical supply, that's the green oval, and each stall has vertical beams to support the roof, that's the violet oval. All of these would be absent in a structure that is erected every day and torn down every night. The next question is all the produce locally grown? The answer is no. In front of the vendor with the wool cap is a pineapple, that's the red oval. Pineapples are not grown in cold weather environments. Neither are the oranges in front of the man with the hooded coat, that's the blue oval. The next question is it close to closing time? The answer is no. Even though it is dark outside, you can see the brightness of the produce that is illuminated by the artificial lights. All the produce sections are piled high with produce. In other words, very little has been sold when this picture was taken, which indicates that the picture was taken early in the day. I hope you all did well. This exercise should give you some insight into the power of inference. From a simple picture of a street produce stand, which is the explicit data, we have used inferencing to gain additional information and data that we can use for advanced analysis. We know it's cold, we know it's early in the day, etc. The time example that I use here is the relationship between endodontic treatment and post and core treatment. The endodontic treatment must be performed and completed before the post and core. Any other temporal relationship between the two is suspect. An episode of endodontics occurs over multiple visits over a range of days. The CDT procedural coding guide indicates that the code covers all tasks necessary to complete the treatment. Hence, a separate charge for an X-ray of the treated area is not allowed since it is part of the episode of care. Clinical knowledge is the next phase as we work towards a better anti-fraud, waste, and abuse strategy. The role of clinicians within anti-fraud, waste, and abuse is analogous to having computer hackers working to improve the security of software and IT systems. IT hackers understand and can spot software vulnerabilities to exploit. Clinicians do the same for insurance billing. Part of the value stems from the clinical training. They know all about effective treatments versus ineffective treatments, triage of severity and sequencing of treatments, off-label treatments and novel treatments, shortcuts, etc. The other part of the value of clinical knowledge is experience. Clinicians talk to other clinicians to share knowledge. They know of other clinicians who are currently gaming the system. They attend continuing education courses that advise them on optimal billing practices that walks the line between correct and incorrect billing. An example of the value of clinical knowledge is the ability to spot fraudulent dental treatments by inferring the amount of local anesthesia that is used to perform the dental treatments. A claim for a lot of dental treatments on the same date of service is received. A non-dentist looking at this would be unconcerned. Multiple dental treatments in a single date of service is fairly common in dental care, and none of the treatments by itself is suspicious. A dentist knows that this number of treatments on a single date of service is unlikely, but not proof of fraud. Further, a dentist also knows that these treatments need local anesthesia, knows the type of anesthesia used, knows how much is administered and how it's administered, and how long the anesthesia lasts. Thus, the dentist is able to calculate the amount of anesthesia used and determine if the total dose is toxic. If it is, then the only conclusion is that the dentist who performed the procedure either gave too much anesthesia on purpose, which is malpractice and possibly criminal assault and battery, or the claim overstates the treatments performed. Since a dentist would never admit purposely administering a toxic dose of anesthesia, the most likely reason is an overstated claim. This is an example of how clinical knowledge improves anti-fraud, waste, and abuse efforts. The next major pillar of the new strategy is forensics. We start by defining what we mean by forensics. In the context of this discussion, forensics is the use of science and logic in criminal investigation. The goal of forensics is to establish quantitative truth within qualitative ambiguity. Now, this is a fancy phrase that's actually easy to understand. For example, if you are investigating a home break-in, you start with a very messy crime scene. Broken glass, open window, furniture and household objects scattered all over the place, etc. This is the qualitative ambiguity. We know that something happened, but we are still not sure about who, what, when, and why. As we look closer, we notice that there's broken glass on the inside of the house. Because science tells us that glass breaks in the direction of the force applied to it, we conclude that the intruder broke the window from the outside, thus pushing the broken glass inside. The intruder then used the opening to unlock and open the window sash to gain entrance. With this, we have now established how the intruder gained entrance. That is, we have established the quantitative truth about the method of entry. These methods are directly applicable to detecting healthcare fraud, waste, and abuse. The key forensic method that we focus on is pattern recognition. This is because most criminal activity, large and small, is a pattern. Criminals do not continually invent new ways to commit crimes. Rather, once they hit on a successful method, they repeat it. If they are successful over time, they may refine and improve the method, which now becomes the new standard pattern. In other words, no one is born a master criminal. No one is born a Professor Moriarty. He or she grows into it. The core feature of a pattern of activity is especially true for financial crimes, including healthcare fraud, waste, and abuse. This is why the news is filled with stories of large, multi-million-dollar healthcare frauds in which the criminal act is straightforward. It just repeats a lot over a long period of time. This understanding gives those who are working to solve fraud, waste, and abuse a great advantage, because once you understand the pattern, You understand how to detect any occurrence of the crime. To put the importance of patterns more succinctly, patterns are the reason why individual small dollar fraud, waste, and abuse becomes multi-million-dollar crime. Understanding patterns allows those on the front lines to discover the fraud, waste, and abuse with limited data. Most importantly, humans are biologically programmed to see patterns. So a focus on patterns complements our inherent strengths rather than rely on our intellect to comprehend abstract mathematical calculations. It is easier to recognize a pattern of a provider who always orders tests in conjunction with a diagnosis than to run a frequency distribution on all the data on all the providers to determine the mean, the median, standard deviation, and then map the suspect provider to a curve to determine the number of standard deviations away from the norm. Patterns are everywhere, even though you may not recognize or appreciate them. So I think it is worthwhile to look at some simple ones to see how powerful pattern recognition is and how it helps in the fight against fraud, waste, and abuse. Specifically, we will consider visual and audio patterns, which deal with core brain functions, mathematical and graphical patterns, which count on education and training to appreciate, and financial patterns to show that even the biggest financial crime is merely a variation of simple patterns. Take a look at these images. The question is, what is the image on the left and what is the image on the right? Unlike the produce market exercise that we did earlier, you don't need time to scrutinize these images. My guess is that you instantaneously recognize the black and white silhouette image on the left as a spider, and the one on the right as an ant. The reason you can answer these questions instantaneously is because this type of recognition happens at a subconscious level. Being able to recognize spiders and ants is essential to your personal safety and well-being. After all, some spiders can kill with a single bite, and a colony of ants can contaminate a household and its food supply. This is an example of an audio pattern. You may recognize this as the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Every time you hear it, you recognize it and you don't mistake it for another song. But even if you did not know that this was a famous song, the music itself induces a feeling of dark foreboding. Bad things are about to happen. This is not happy music and will never be happy music. As a test, try singing the words, "I have good news, I have good news." Doesn't work, does it? Like the visual pattern example from the previous slide, this feeling is invoked by the music pattern and occurs at a subconscious level. At times, an audio pattern can have a corresponding visual pattern and vice versa. In this slide, we can see the Beethoven's Fifth represented in audio and visual. As we get into the realm of more abstract patterns, we first consider mathematical patterns. These are math formulas that describe events in the real world. And because these math formulas are abstract, they can apply to multiple real-life events. The first example in this slide is a simple one from high school. The 3-4-5 triangle formula can be used to calculate the diagonal of any room with a 90-degree corner. The second example is more relevant for our purposes. The Fibonacci sequence applies to everything in biology. The basic sequence and formula are an accurate description of how biology works. The sequence explains the number of leaves on a plant, the shape of a chambered nautilus, the shape of an egg, and the measurement of ideal human beauty, better known as the golden ratio of 1.63 to 1. A close relative to mathematical patterns are graphical patterns. In this slide, we see a graph of the S&P 500 over an 18-year period. This is the blue line that slopes towards the upper right of the graph. As one would expect, there are lots of ups and downs on this line. The red line that slopes towards the upper right is outlined by the rectangle with the dashed purple line, are the returns by Bernie Madoff over the same time period. In case you've forgotten, Bernie Madoff is responsible for the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, an $11 billion fraud. The first indication that there's something wrong is the steadiness of Madoff returns. There's almost no variation in the line. The second thing to notice is the size of the deviation between the S&P 500 and Bernie Madoff. The orange rectangle shows an early indication that something is wrong. This is followed by the green rectangle in which the difference between the S&P 500 and Bernie Madoff is even larger. The final and most glaring clues are the red rectangles in which the S&P 500 drops precipitously, but Bernie Madoff shows a steady gain. Any one of these findings should have alerted authorities. Let's move the pattern discussion away from the abstract into real-world patterns. Healthcare fraud, waste, and abuse is part of a larger category of financial crimes, which includes phishing, insider trading, and insurance injury scams. Each of these is different, but they all hold lessons for healthcare fraud, waste, and abuse. In phishing, the bad guys hope to gain by pretending to be a trusted source and hoping that the victim falls for it. The healthcare analog to phishing is when a provider uses their trusted relationship with a patient to perform an upcoded procedure or to do a procedure with only marginal justification for that procedure. For example, a dentist may decide to tell a patient that there is a cavity that needs a filling, when in fact the caries is very small and can be treated with a less expensive sealant. Insider trading is where the leadership uses its inside knowledge to gain an advantage at the expense of others who do not have that inside knowledge. The healthcare analog to this is a provider who treats to the benefit plan rather than to the medical necessity. So a bad provider may perform ultrasonic muscle therapy because it is covered, when bed rest would work just fine. In the injury insurance scam, a provider takes advantage of a patient's injury to submit claims for unneeded treatment and uses a difficult-to-disprove diagnosis to justify the treatments. The chiropractor who treats a minor car accident patient for whiplash is the standard cliché of the injury insurance scam. The common theme is that there is a vulnerability that is being exploited. Whether it is using a position of trust, or using insider knowledge, or using hard-to-disprove diagnoses to do bad things, the bad guys use these openings to steal money. However, it also means that we can use the same vulnerability to build detection algorithms. Using the dental example of the overtreated small cavity, we can use our knowledge that dental caries progresses very slowly, along with a treatment history that shows no significant dental disease in the past, to infer that it's highly unlikely that the patient suddenly needs a crown. Everything that I have discussed up till now will make you better at your job, but does nothing to improve the overall results of the anti-fraud, waste, and abuse fight. If you remember, we are currently losing nearly $9,000 per second. You as individuals can only do so much in a day. In order to make a real impact, we need to build these ideas, methods, and tools into an IT platform. Let IT do what IT does best, which is to do a lot of calculations very quickly with minimal to no human interaction. Humans provide the knowledge and insight and then use the results to stop fraud, waste, and abuse. IT does everything in between. So humans do what humans do best, while IT does what IT does best. The end result, the work is done in bulk, across all schemes, faster, cheaper, and better than an army of investigators. The IT contribution is divided into two parts, the software and the hardware. The software part is where you separate the great from the good. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to deal with great software design, and the actual writing of software code is not your prime responsibility. But there are a few principles to keep in mind as you work with the software developers and programmers who will actually build what you want. First, focus on the building detection algorithms of known fraudulent patterns. Address the known problems before you attempt to deal with the unknown. Create data structures and applications that will allow you to implement the informatics principles we described earlier. Design the user interface for ease of use and intuitive actions. It is not necessary to crowd every bit of data onto a computer screen. Use open source as much as possible. The hardware consideration is very simple. Use a cloud service provider like Amazon, Microsoft, or Google Web Services unless your company has a hard and fast prohibition against cloud services. There is almost no advantage to using internally maintained client-server hardware, and the advantages of cloud service providers are multitude. I have listed 4 specific advantages of the cloud, but it all boils down to 2 simple reasons. No insurer can attract and hire the depth, the breadth, and the sheer number of highest caliber IT talent like the cloud providers. Secondly, no insurer can afford the IT upgrade cycle in order to maintain state-of-the-art capabilities. Lastly, and the most important consideration for advancing fraud, waste, and abuse capabilities is leadership. If leadership is not 100% behind this effort, then nothing will get done. Let me repeat that. If leadership is not 100% behind this effort, then nothing will get done. Right now, there is 60 plus years of pay and chase momentum. The career path of an entire population of analysts, investigators, managers, and staff are dependent on the incentives and success metrics surrounding pay and chase. A single $1 million fraud prosecution with a recovery of 10 cents on the dollar is more likely to get you a promotion than preventing 100 providers from submitting $1,000 in upcoded charges. Both are equivalent dollar amounts, $100,000, but the single $1 million case gets the notice and the publicity. Only if they are sure that leadership wants a change will anyone risk their careers on something. This is why the reusable vertical landing rockets, just like in the 1950s science fiction, are built by Elon Musk and SpaceX, not NASA. You cannot tell me that the NASA scientists, engineers, and contractors are not smart enough to do this. NASA people built the Voyager spacecraft that is still working after 30 years in space and has made it into interstellar space. The NASA people saved the Apollo 13 astronauts after the spacecraft blew up on the way to the moon. The NASA guys landed the Opportunity rover on Mars, and it is still driving on the Martian surface after 14 years. You cannot tell me that these guys are not smart enough to create a rocket that lands vertically. The reason that it took SpaceX to do it is Elon Musk. His leadership was behind the effort 100%. None of the leadership in NASA wanted to do it, so a vertical landing rocket, even if the engineers, scientists, and contractors wanted to do it, would not get done. Leadership would not risk it. Leaders who champion the new must understand that being behind a new concept is more than just cheerleading. It involves some hard decisions that involve disrupting the status quo, and any changes to the status quo is likely to create friction in the workplace. Specifically, the artificial barriers between the silos of program integrity, utilization, payment, and special investigative units must be broken. These barriers will not fall unless someone at the top can force it to happen. Only the leader can push for something that benefits the company but may disrupt each and every silo. If the silos are allowed to determine the outcome, each will support only those things that benefit the silo and reject everything that detracts from their power, prestige, money, and importance, even if this is bad for the company as a whole. The actions taken against those who are discovered committing fraud, waste, and abuse needs to change. It needs to change from a focus on law enforcement with the threat of punishment to administration with pressure to effect behavior change. This is critical since the current approach is hamstrung by the fact that the standard of evidence to achieve enforcement and punishment is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the criminal standard. This is very difficult to achieve since so much of healthcare is gray, ambiguous, and context dependent. For example, how do we determine the difference between moderate and severe pain? And since this is so difficult to determine, can we punish a doctor who codes for treatments based on severe pain versus moderate pain? If we instead handle these problems at the administrative level, effective action is simplified. Stopping the payment is a routine business operation, as opposed to the recovery of money, which is laborious, time-consuming, and costly. In addition, the standard of evidence changes from beyond a reasonable doubt to preponderance of evidence. In other words, the new standard is the evidence needs to be more likely correct than not. This allows us to leverage evidence that by itself is not proof of bad acts like statistical outliers. This allows us to confront a provider who is doing a lot of small dollar upcodes on a routine basis. The evidence clearly points to bad behavior, but because of the small dollar amounts, it is not cost effective to pursue law enforcement. I will dive much deeper into this issue in the second webinar that deals with how to achieve prevention through behavior change. Leadership must be careful not to go overboard. I have laid out the details on how to break out of the pay and chase rut with new ideas, methods, and tools. It is tempting to think, why stop here? Perhaps other sexy, cutting-edge ideas will produce similar gains. Predictive models have gotten a lot of press recently, but like most overly hyped things, the marketing exceeds the reality. The key fault with predictive models is the models can only tell you what is likely to happen. Even without a predictive model, we already know what is likely to happen. That is, the bad guys will continue to submit bad claims, and we already know what schemes will be used. So the information gleaned from a predictive model does not add to what we already know. Artificial intelligence is just as problematic at this time. The best known AI solution is IBM's Watson. AI is designed to take open-ended questions and provide the best answers. This works best if the question involves a complex analysis of all the evidence to support all positions in order to come up with the single best answer. Fraud, waste, and abuse is much simpler to detect, so the power of Watson is overkill. And the cost to implement AI is very high compared to the alternative that we have just presented. So while both have some utility, neither are compelling enough to warrant the investment in time and resources. I have gone through a great deal of information over a short period of time. I don't expect you to absorb everything based on one exposure to this webinar. If this topic truly interests you, I suggest that you review this webinar again in a couple of weeks. Each time you do, I think you will get a little bit more each time. For now, I want to leave you with the high points that I would like you to take home. Pay and chase has reached its limits. If we are to do better against fraud, waste, and abuse, we need new approaches. I have presented one. There are probably others waiting to be discovered and built. Truly leverage the power of the information age. A lot of manual work combined with a basic database and Excel spreadsheets is not leveraging the information age. Build smart algorithms that incorporate your expertise into computer code, then let the computer do its thing automatically and 24/7. Data is limiting. Informatics is expansive. Use informatics. Mindset is the critical first step. If your mind is dead set against change, any attempt at doing something new will fail. Detect and prevent is the next wave. It engages fraud, waste, and abuse early, which allows us to stop fraudulent payment. This means dollar-for-dollar savings rather than pennies on the dollar recovery. It also allows us to implement reward programs for the good providers and to incentivize the bad providers into becoming good providers. I will discuss this in detail in the second webinar. So, if you implement all the things in this webinar, what kind of results can you expect? That is impossible to say, but there are some guidelines. Fraudlines is built on these principles and has analyzed over 71 million paid dental claims that paid out $15 billion in payments as part of an historical post-pay review. We found $1.1 billion in excess payments due to fraud, waste, and abuse. That equates to 7.4% of the paid money. Preliminary work with medical shows the same level of results. To ballpark the kind of results you can achieve, just multiply your total payout by 7%. So the billion-dollar question is 7% or some fraction of 7% of your total payout worth the effort to implement the change? Here is my contact information in case you have any questions, as well as my LinkedIn profile where you can find links to full scientific papers and presentations that touch on this and other related topics. I thank you for your time and your attention.